Hello, welcome to the Module 5 overview for WST 591 Professionalizing Feminisms. This module focuses on a particular kind of nonprofit and public good, education, K through 12 education, university, college education, and in a democracy, public education is a hallmark. Yet we know in the United States that literacy, knowledge, that those have always been political and politicized. So even looking back at times of enslavement, during times of enslavement, it was illegal to teach someone who was enslaved how to read. And if you were enslaved, it was illegal to know how to read, to teach others to read, to be caught reading. When we as a country, right, got rid of slavery as an institution. Slavery itself became illegal and unconstitutional. We then had Jim Crow laws, separate but equal laws, and part of that was also around politics and political engagement. So, for example, Black people were often, in many ways, prevented from voting, threatened away from voting. Some of the ways that they were prevented from voting were things like voter poll taxes, so you'd have to pay in order to be able to vote, which is illegal. And oftentimes there were literacy tests, and you had to pass a literacy test before you were able to vote. And the literacy tests were often quite difficult to ensure that they could turn Black people away, and white voters were not necessarily given those literacy tests or asked to, pay a poll tax. Fast forward to today, and today what you have is an attack on public education. So you may have heard or seen the quote from Vice President Vance making the rounds on social media where he calls professors the enemy. And I want to point out that Vance is actually quoting President Nixon, right? So this is not a new sentiment. This sentiment of public education being dangerous to powers that be, being dangerous to authoritarian figures, being dangerous to capitalism, this is not new. What's new is the turbulent, very fast wave of executive orders and other engagements from the federal government that are not necessarily legal and or not necessarily following a proper protocol. That is what's new. But this idea of education is dangerous, this is not new to the United States. And in fact, we could say that that's actually part of the fabric of our history. Now, in 2021, Vance gave this speech where he quoted President Nixon saying professors are the enemy. This speech itself, I believe, was entitled Universities Are the Enemy, right? So really what they're saying is that learning is the enemy. What about learning is so dangerous, right? I'd also like to point out that Vance himself has college degrees. He graduated both from Ohio State University and Yale University, right? Very prestigious schools. Only 9 presidents have ever, only 9 presidents did not have a college degree, right? So clearly we actually do appreciate education, but education for who, right? So all of your readings this week are looking at and exploring the ways that this sudden attack on DEI, which feels sudden, is actually part of something much more long-term. And also the ways in which the attacks on DEI are being used to justify attacks on education, being used to justify attacks on research bodies like the National Science Foundation, being used to attack other research entities like the Centers for Disease Control, which is a body that engages with public health to ensure that we are safe, right? Anytime you have a group of people who live together, this is a little bit of anthropology for you, anytime you have people who form groups like we do, we live communally, then you're gonna have disease. And so the CDC is a entity that helps identify, track, respond to, and also prevent those from happening. Now, these are all institutions that are being defunded, that are being attacked as being inefficient or as money sucks, even though we have so much data to show that that's not true. So your readings are really focusing on the attack on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Some of places had expanded that to add a B, DEIB, for diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, right? But all of that, right, has had to go away. And many institutions, including ASU, have been pre-complying. So they're not waiting until they actually are told you have to do this. They're pre-complying. And ASU 2 summers ago, right, not this past summer, but the previous summer, scrubbed all the diversity stuff off of its website, except for Black excellence, which many scholars note that instead of saying Black liberation, Black racial justice, that Black excellence became the neoliberal stand-in. ASU much more recently scrubbed services and supports from its websites for LGBTQ students, particularly transgender specific resources and supports, right? So if learning is the enemy, then it's not just about attacking and defunding K-12 public education and higher education, but then also attacking libraries, public libraries, museums, right? Places that we can go see art, even the Smithsonian, right? These have all been under attack. Places where, you know, PBS, right? Sesame Street, NPR, public news, archived data. All of this is being rolled back, attacked, defunded, destaffed, some various mix therein, which is causing a loss of access to knowledge and access to the process of learning. Why wouldn't you want an educated public, an informed public? Like, truly, these are questions to ask yourself, right? Particularly in a democracy. If we are a democracy, political scientists are not certain of that. And it's interesting because when we say that learning is the enemy, from a very neoliberal perspective, that's not what businesses are saying. What businesses want, they say what they want from college graduates are college graduates who are critical thinking problem solvers who work well with others. Right? That's why we do DEIB. This is why we have courses where you're learning about how the social world works, right? Businesses are not asking for students to come out trained in that particular business, a lot of times because, particularly for the past 20, 30 years, technology changes at such quick rates that the jobs that were around when you started college are probably going to be a bit different than the jobs that are around when you end college, and particularly another probably 5 years out, right? So what we need are people who are good at problem solving, right? If the printer runs out of ink, can you figure out how to fix it? If 2 people call out sick, can you figure out how to cover their shifts, the work that they need to do? If there's conflict in a group, can you resolve that conflict without it exploding and impacting the workplace, right? These are things that businesses are talking about. So then why is it that politicians, and a very narrow part of, I would say, the political parties are attacking education? In the DEI readings, you're going to learn that feminist scholars, critical scholars, we have long been critical of DEI efforts. We have been critical of DEI efforts for being performative, right? All universities have DEI or had DEI offices, yet all universities had Black and brown students who would still report extreme cases of discrimination, racial violence, racial exclusion at the hands of students, staff, and or faculty, right? So just having those offices weren't necessarily doing much. So there was a lot of critique from scholars, including actually Sarah Ahmed, who also wrote a book called Living a Feminist Life, where she critiques and actually talks about why she left higher education because she was so frustrated at the lack of protections for students. Right? DEI, similar to human resources, were responses to unions when union organizing was much more robust, sort of mid-century, last century, and earlier. Human resources, DEI, those were ways for businesses and even nonprofits to say, like, look, see, we're okay, it's fine, you don't need a union, we have DEI programming, look at all this programming, right? It's okay, we have human resources, you can complain to human resources. So DEI is actually a very neoliberal aspect to trying to address inequalities. And we have a lot of research that shows that those DEI efforts don't work, right? So engaging in a 20-minute webinar that you have to watch, or engaging in an hour-long in-person class to teach you to not be racist to your Black colleagues, to teach you to not be so discriminatory to your Muslim colleagues, to teach you to not sexually harass your colleagues, to teach you that gender does go beyond a binary, right? Those short workshops, those webinars have very, very, very limited impact. But what they have done is allowed a business to say, check, check, see, we've tried. Now, the attacks on DEI today are very different than the critiques that I and other scholars were making, than other critical scholars were making. Their argument is that DEI is unfair advantage, right? Their argument is that DEI allows unqualified people into positions. And again, tons of research that shows this is not true. So really, the attack on DEI is a way for people to be racist. It's a way to be racist that doesn't sound overtly racist. We could say that this is an implicit racism, which makes sense for today, where we have, for example, laws, right, that do not talk about race, but yet we know that they are very racialized. So in many ways, right, this is why I include the reading from the NWACP about woke, that talks through the origins of the word woke, right? Because again, these anti-woke bills, anti-DEI bills, really what they're saying is we don't want Black and brown people to be in positions of power. We don't want Black and brown people to be educated, informed, and to be a working part of the populace, right? It's a very white supremacist argument. There's also arguments that DEI privileges certain people over others, which is kind of funny because what DEI is actually teaching is about social stratification, right? A lot, and I'll just share this with you. I'm just like, gosh, I wish half these politicians and half these activists, right, if they just took Gender Studies 101, or if they just took Justice Studies 101, or if they just took Ethnic Studies 101, and maybe a couple other classes, maybe some poli-sci classes, so that they could learn how the political system actually works, we wouldn't be where we're at, right? An irony here is that the attacks on DEI are arguing that it's justified because DEI excludes people, right? Well, it makes white people feel bad, or it makes cisgender people feel bad. We're not really cared about feelings really here. What we're caring about is historical accuracy, right? Further, when you say, hey, we're getting rid of DEI, and by getting rid of DEI, we're going to ban books, we're going to remove archived data, we're going to change data, so it's no longer accurate, because they wanted to change things. For example, if there were gender markers, right, allowing for more than 2 genders, they're going to go back through and change that in existing research, right? They're actually excluding people and viewpoints. So ironically, they're saying that this, effort to engage in DEI is excluding people, wherein that's never actually been the case. But what they are doing is, in fact, exclusion and oppression. When you exclude people and exclude ideas from centers of knowledge, from knowledge making, from knowledge sharing, knowledge production, right, that is a form of oppression. This is one reason why historians and other scholars and practitioners are arguing that we seem to be in a period of resegregation, or at least an attempt at resegregation. Because again, interestingly, the attacks on DEI are actually attacks on learning diverse perspectives, on learning about inclusion, on learning about equity. And we purposely say equity instead of equality, because being equal may not actually be as helpful as equity, which recognizes the historical and contemporary socio-political forces that might make, my access a bit different than your access. What's also really ironic is that one of the main benefactors of DEI practices in the United States, in terms of both businesses and higher education, have been poor white women. Poor white women are the ones who have actually been able to benefit the most. And I include myself in this. Like, this is, I started at a community college. I did not plan to get a 4-year degree. I definitely did not plan on becoming a professor. But through various, supports, here I am. We're in an odd period. Not only are we talking about attacks on DEI, we're also talking about the ways that anti-Semitism has been weaponized. I myself am Jewish. I am a Jewish person who personally critiques nation states. I critique the United States as a nation state, any nation state, right? This is what we do. Also critiquing Israel as a nation state. Critiquing a nation state is not anti-Semitism, right? Being anti-Jewish is anti-Semitism, right? I have experienced a lot of anti-Semitism in my life, particularly because my last name doesn't register as Jewish because my mother did not marry a Jewish person. And there's stereotypes about what Jewish people look like, right? So I have heard and experienced a lot of anti-Semitism in my life. I grew up in Central Florida where the KKK would do cross burnings in people's yards. I lived very rural for the first 15 years of my life. Right? Critiquing a nation state is not anti-Semitism, yet that is what our federal government is now defining as anti-Semitism. This is very, very dangerous. This is saying that critique of a nation state is potentially terroristic activity. And if you think they're only going to apply that to the state of Israel, I would imagine that this is also, and I and other scholars believe that this is also, right, a way to ensure that anyone speaking out against the United States, right, critiquing the United States, right, is automatically considered to be engaging in terroristic activity, right? And this is ironic for those of us who are in areas of education because we always critique. Critique is process. Critique is theorizing. Critique is how we move things differently. Oftentimes we critique the things that we love or we critique things that we want to do better by us. Right? You cannot legislate people out of existence. People exist. Laws should reflect the people that exist. But oftentimes our practices don't reflect social reality. And that's what we call power. Right? And that's why in all your courses, you're studying power and how power flows. Resistance is a form of power, right? Bottom up. Authoritarianism is a form of power, right? Top down, right? There's many ways that power flows. And that is really what you're engaging with in these readings. In reading about DEI, you will learn more about how DEI wasn't ever actually fulfilling what we think it might be fulfilling. I particularly encourage you to take notes on the piece Privileging Whiteness in Higher Education Institutions, Critical Discourse Analysis of White Racial Frames and Diversity Strategic Plans, right? Because what scholars have been finding, is that those DEI efforts, we'll focus just on higher ed, that those DEI efforts were still focused around the sense of white people's feelings, white people's sense of safety, white people's sense of well-being, white people's asserted needs. So, for example, in the first Trump presidency, I was working at a Hispanic serving institution in New York City. I was working at a CUNY. CUNY stands for City University of New York. And I was working at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. That's where I worked. I was in sociology and women and gender studies. And the day after Trump was elected, many of my students of color reported harassment from white students. So students wearing hijabs and headscarves, right? White students were pulling their headscarves down as they were walking through the hallways. White dude students were shoulder checking other students in the hallway, students of color in the hallway. The women who worked in the cafeteria, because you could, purchase food there. So there was the cashiers. They were all Latina, and students were like throwing the food at them, or would throw the money at them and laugh, or would if you've ever, it's really painful actually, like had a nickel or a penny or a dime and you flick it, right? And you do that and it flies and it hurts really hard. And they were doing that to them, right? And so then there was a discussion among the administration of the schools to what to do. And what happened was that white students were going to the administrators saying that they felt unsafe and uncomfortable in their classrooms because the classrooms were discussing the first Trump election, and how it made them feel, right? Because Trump, is racist, he is sexist, he is, now we know for sure, a rapist, right? Those things were already known about Trump. And so having those discussions were enough to make white students feel uncomfortable and unsafe, some white students, and they went and complained to the administration. And what did the administration do? Did they do things to protect the students who were being shoulder checked and having their headscarves pulled down and being spit at and told horrible things? No. They told us professors that we needed to make sure that we had, I can't remember the words that they used, but basically that that we had a classroom setting that ensured that white students felt comfortable. Not about learning, about feelings. And this is why I would say that Sarah Ahmed's book, right, the Feminist Killjoy Handbook, is so helpful because it really helps us think through the ways that, we're not talking about protecting other people's feelings. We're talking about how to protect people from violence, exploitation, oppression, and exclusion. I provided an optional reading called A Phoenix Rising that's actually about ASU, and it comes from this book, In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, How Universities Are Plundering Our Cities. And I love this chapter because it's not about DEI, except I would say it is, but not explicitly about DEI. It focuses on how universities, public institutions like ASU, are kind of real estate moguls and are engaging in deals that feel much more business-like than nonprofit-like, and are reshaping and arguably harming neighborhoods. So if you read about what ASU has done in downtown Tempe and surrounding areas, right, it paints a very different picture than what ASU itself purports, right? Now, that's an optional reading. You don't have to engage with it, but I thought since we're at ASU and Dr. Baldwin's book is a very well-known book, that it would be a useful addition and a useful way to shore up our critiques of nonprofits, right? To understand the limits and limitations of nonprofits, or the ways in which nonprofits sometimes use those nonprofit rules and regulations in ways that perhaps they were not originally intended to, right? Not the ethos of helping, not the ethos of solidarity. In Module 5, you're continuing to read the Feminist Killjoy Handbook, and you're starting to get to know a little bit more about the different feminist killjoy ideal types, right? Are you the cultural critic? Are you the philosopher? Are you the activist, right? And so pay attention to these ideal types in these chapters, because at the end of the semester for your final, I'm going to ask you to write a paper where you're analyzing a nonprofit from a provided list and envisioning yourself there in your capacity as that particular killjoy, right? Like, what kind of feminist killjoy are you? In this module, Module 5, you will be choosing that particular nonprofit. So there's an additional assignment here in Module 5. It's very quick. You just have to go look at the list and pick a nonprofit. I have hyperlinked to those nonprofits so that you can easily explore their webpage, check out their social medias as well. Oftentimes, social medias of nonprofits are much more robust and insightful than their websites. The websites tend to be a bit more bland than the social medias. Not always, but often. And so for Module 5, just choose the nonprofit. If you know of a nonprofit that isn't listed, please reach out to me and I'll let you know whether or not I approve it for use in that particular assignment. In Module 6, also kind of week 6. In Module 6, you will then analyze this particular organization that you chose, the nonprofit that you chose. So remember, you're choosing this nonprofit because in the following module, you're going to analyze it. And then in our last module for your final, you're going to imagine yourself working at this nonprofit, or potentially even as a client of the nonprofit, whatever makes more sense to you. But I would say as a worker for the nonprofit. I recognize, again, that this course, and particularly this module, it has a lot of immediacy. You are students. You are engaging in learning because you want to go into, most likely, a nonprofit field or an NGO field or some other government institution or organization, right? One of my cousins, he basically does forestry, and I thought it was a job that would be very stable. And yet, even things like, even organizations that oversee the safety of public parks and the well-being of public parks, right, are under attack as well. All to say, I recognize that it is difficult to read things when it's about you. So you're reading about what's happening in the world at this very particular moment, and that's hard. I really appreciate the conversations that you've been having on Harmonize, on both of the Harmonizes, because I view those as ways of helping us make sense of what's happening in the social world today. We're living in a world where the Department of Education itself is under attack, potentially to be totally defunded. We don't know what this will hold for us. We do know that these attacks take In some ways, things are happening very immediately, and in other ways, things will take time. Things are going to be wrapped up in courts for a long time. This is why attacks on DEI are coming after programming and programming staff first rather than educators, especially at the higher ed level, because at the higher ed level, we have something called academic freedom, which means that my curriculum is my curriculum based on my expertise, right? I research what I research based on my expertise. No one is telling me what to research or what to teach. This may change in the future, but not for a while, because this is currently, there's lawsuits in Florida and I think one other state where they're trying to gain curricular control. It will take time. And again, I know this all feels new, but this isn't necessarily new. It's just the latest incarnation of anti-intellectualism, of racism. So think about what disciplining academic scholarship, think about what disciplining learning means to you and for you as you read through the readings for Module 5 and as you start to think about the nonprofit that you want to engage with. Thank you for engaging, and I look forward to seeing your work online. Thank you.